Welcome back. Joining me today is my buddy Royce Kurmelovs. Royce is a journalist and the author of 4 books, including The Death of Holden and Just Money. His work has appeared in several notable outlets, including Vice, The Guardian, and SBS. He's here today to help us understand how journalism is produced. Royce, you've chosen to be a journalist by profession, but a lot of people hate journalists. Why are you such a masochist?
Yeah, well, I mean, journalism is one of the world's most least trusted professions, but I mean, it's important not to confuse those of us who try to do good work with the hacks of the profession.
Okay, so let's take a step back and think about journalism more broadly. Journalism appears in a whole bunch of kinds of media, right? What are some of those media outlets that journalism appears in today?
Well, I mean, yeah, the media industry is diverse. It's an ecosystem, right? So you have, at base level, you have your tabloid media and you have your broadsheet media. These are the two fundamental divisions in news. The difference is that newspaper is what most people in South Australia would understand as like the advertiser. A broadsheet is a publication in Australia is more like the Australian. And the difference is quite literally the size of the paper. And this goes back to an old division where the idea being that broadsheet papers were something that was more detailed, more analysis driven, that was more considered more reliable fundamentally. This was essentially how all papers were published. But the advent of the tabloid newspaper was a product of Rupert Murdoch, which was a huge innovation towards the media industry. Essentially, this threw out the old model and kind of made it a bit more punchy, more immediate, and more, some might say, trashy.
Well, hold on a second here, because where I'm from, when we talk about tabloids, we talk about things like the National Enquirer that ran stories like Alien Boy coming to Earth and doing X, Y, and Z thing. And when we think about broadsheet newspapers, we're thinking about things like the Chicago Sun or the New York Times. So here in Australia, those terms don't actually have the same kind of stigma.
No, they did, but we're talking about a long history here. So we're talking about the creation of tabloid journalism was something that occurred over decades. The form that we understand it today, it was created by Rupert Murdoch as an innovation towards the news industry, and he was quite famously a South Australian, I won't say native, but certainly a celebrity here. Essentially what this did was created a news industry out of 3 elements: crime, celebrity, and sport. And the combination of those things made news more accessible to the average person, made caught readers' interest, and essentially sold papers. But when it came to broadsheet papers, you have this long legacy of kind of more investigative reporting, of more detailed reporting, of like more factual reporting. And so this was supposed to be the, if I can use this as a pejorative term, the thinking man's newspaper. However, because it was inaccessible, the market for these sorts of publications eroded. And this has a lot to do with the economics of the way the news industry works in terms of publication costs and the cost to pay reporters. But over time, the tabloid style has essentially dominated.
Okay, but you're still talking about people reading a paper. But in this day and age, when's the last time I've seen a paper? I've never seen anything on anybody's doorstep. Most people get their news served to them. What's going on now?
Yeah, so the media industry in the last 10, even 20 years has undergone a fundamental revolution with the advent of digital and online. And so where the creation of the tabloid media and that innovation kind of revolutionized the industry through the 80s, in the 80s through to the 90s, the internet changed everything again. And there's a lot of debate and conversation around this. There's a lot of criticism about how news organizations were slow to adopt this new technology, but it has been revolutionary. And so today, people acquire their news and information from websites, from even things like Substack, Twitter, even social media. You have this proliferation of sources of information, and what you're essentially looking at is the uncoupling of everything the newspaper was. Whereas a newspaper was your news, your opinion, your sport, your classifieds, everything that was combined into one, this has now been taken apart and has been turned into its own little service. So you might go to Gumtree for your classifieds, you might go to Twitter for your opinion, you might go to like all these separate places. And this has fundamentally changed how the industry operates once more.
So a lot of people today are claiming to be journalists, right? And I can think of a lot of examples of citizen journalists, folks who have no formal training, no affiliation necessarily with mainstream press, but they consider themselves to be the guardians of the real truth. What makes somebody a journalist, and what gives them license to actually claim that?
Yeah, and it's a really good question, right? But you have to take a bit of a step back. So journalism as a practice is about taking verifiable fact and information and arranging it into a form that that the average person can read and consume and understand. It forms a basis for understanding the world around us and for engaging with each other. And the thing to understand about journalism is that there is some debate about what exactly it is, but no one's quite been able to define what that is, and that's kind of a good thing. My personal view on this is that journalism is a trade. So it's something that you learn how to do by development, and you have a certain skill of mastery of your craft. You understand how to deal with sources, how to verify fact, how to obtain that fact, and how to arrange it on a page. Now, this is in contrast to something like thinking of journalism as if it's a profession. Because journalism, unlike, say, lawyers or engineers, has no professional body, has no independent kind of organization that provides regulatory oversight about ethics or breaches of standards. It's, there is the journalist union that publishes the code of conduct for, in terms of ethics. But other than that, there's no kind of no one looking over your shoulder to make sure you're doing the right thing.
Is that true just in Australia, or is that something which is true around the world?
That is true around the world. So journalists, as they operate, primarily are about publishing this verifiable information to a mass audience in some form. And the reason why this stuff is important to understand is that there is a big difference between someone who is blogging and someone who is working for a major commercial news organization and someone who's just posting to Facebook on social media, right? Because there's often an element of quality control that goes into this stuff. A blogger can be doing actual journalism, or they cannot. A journalist working in a major news organization will usually have an editor and several sub-editors that are reviewing their work to make sure that what they're saying is correct and accurate and correctly spelled. And I think this is important because you need to understand that journalism is a trade. And it's the same as if you're going to a mechanic for your car, right? You might take your car to two mechanics, one good, one bad. Just because you get bad service at one doesn't mean that that guy's not a mechanic. However, you wouldn't exactly take your car to like a refrigerator repairman to repair because he knows nothing about vehicles, right? And that's kind of a good, rule of thumb for thinking about journalism.
Okay, so there's a tremendous number of outlets that are out there. And I know that one of the narratives that we hear today is that people are really challenged in terms of how they should trust all of the sources of information that they're exposed to. When folks are engaging with news media or information media, what should they be considering when they're making the decision of whether to trust or not to trust something?
You're right, it is extremely hard with the flood of information that we get every day, all day. And a lot of the stuff comes down to who is providing this information and how much work has gone into kind of verifying that information. For instance, social media is very, very good at firing from the hip. On Twitter, as a good example, is there was a guy who reported the assault on the compound where Osama bin Laden was hiding, right? He tweeted it first. His information turned out to be accurate because he happened to be some guy standing in his neighborhood and tweeted it to the world. And he was the guy that blew up this special operation, right? And so in that sense, that is news, right? Because that is new, it is happening right now, it is current. And it was verifiably accurate, he was proven to be correct. However, there have been several other situations where Twitter in particular is a good example, has, reported something as it was happening and reported it inaccurately, and people have acted upon that information, and that information has turned out to be wrong, and in the process of acting on that information, they have done harm. So the way journalism works is that nothing gets published, well, ideally, because obviously some people do this, not all the same, but nothing gets published until it can be verified independently of the person telling it to you. And this means that you can rely on this information because as a journalist, and this is something I take very seriously in terms of my responsibility, is that the stuff I published, people have to rely on it. They have to rely on it to invest. They might rely on it to make decisions about their life. If I get something wrong, I can get someone fired, or I can break up a marriage, or I can cause a company's stock price to crash. So there is a huge responsibility on me to make sure that I check the information I get going forward. And so this is the difference between some guy posting on Facebook about how something's terrible, and which is essentially an opinion, versus someone who actually does the work to check with the sources, ask what happened here, make sure the information they're getting is correct as best they can at that moment.
That's a lot of power for somebody who doesn't get paid that much.
I mean, look, the industry is in a state of flux as always, and there's a lot of time pressures on people who do this sorts of work, because like what we're living in right now is essentially the 24-hour news environment, right? For instance, if I get assigned a story, sometimes I will have to go out and produce a 400 to 500 word news report in the space of a couple of hours. When I cover something like a court case, I have to file 4 or 5 times a day on a very busy day. So there is there's a lot of competing interests and a lot of competing pressures about how you put together that material, but that's part of the job. Your job is to be accurate, quick, and informed.
So, speaking of the job, the freedom of the press is something which is codified in our legal system in the United States. It was recognized way back when that the press had a very important role to play in terms of reporting on what public officials were doing. And that's why that's such an important right that we have in the United States. What is the role of the press here in Australia, and what sorts of rights and responsibilities do journalists here have?
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, I'm very envious of kind of the media culture that's evolved in the US. And there is a real deep history of, the importance of journalism and and all the facets that involves, everything from your basic just the facts news reporting through to kind of long form nonfiction. There is a real culture of that. And the US has the advantage of being a state where I think it's the First Amendment protections, free speech, is written into the Constitution, which means you cannot change it. In Australia, the situation is slightly different. Here, there is no right to free speech that's been written into any kind of constitutional document. The best we have is the implied right to political communication that's been recognized in the courts. And this was basically done because there was some recognition in the High Court that essentially to run a democracy, you need to be able to talk about stuff. And if you can't allow people to express their political opinions, you can't really evaluate those ideas, right? But then the catch is that this implied right to political communication has boundaries and limits and can, and those boundaries and limits shift. And then there's other competing factors in Australian society. For instance, our defamation laws are very, very strict, which means that you have to be very, very sure about what you're reporting, and you have to be able to stand something up before you can report something about someone who is, say, very, very important, or a public figure, because you want to be very, very sure about what you're saying is true.
So, how does that impact the way that journalists go about their job here in Australia compared to the way that journalists go about their job in the United States?
Well, in Australia, it means that you have to again, if you want to engage in investigative journalism, if you want to engage in anything that requires in-depth reporting, you have to be very sure about what you're saying before you say it. And so often that means stories have to be very carefully thought about, vetted, and and even legaled by lawyers who know about these things before they can run. What you need to understand is that what you're reading when you see something on the page, particularly if it's kind of a longer feature or a work of long-form journalism, is that a lot of human effort, a lot of work has gone into making sure that this thing is something that not only you can enjoy as a reader, as a product, but also something that you can rely on to make decisions going forward, whether it's about how you vote, where you want to live, how you want to live, all those sorts of questions. That's what it's there for.
So, getting it right is obviously very important. It's part of the journalistic culture here. Is it a norm that we see throughout the world?
There's similar problems around the world, but in different ways. And it's a job that is, in some cases, very, very dangerous. In some parts of the world, people who are just kind of just trying to report basic facts often find themselves being pressured, being attacked, and sometimes even coming under a violent attack. People are killed for doing journalism. A good example is, for instance, in the Philippines, there's been a series of elections where people have covered events and there have been massacres of journalists who report on these events. The same has occurred, for instance, in Malta. There was a famous case where a journalist who was an incredible journalist was working on the Panama Papers, which was revealing and uncovering a lot of white-collar crime, was assassinated, I think, in her car. You're seeing similar situations in terms of conflict reporting. So in Russia, for instance, if you're a journalist who's not Russian looking to get into Russia, the price of a visa to get into Russia has just spiked exponentially. And if you're a Russian journalist, if you talk about whatever's happening with the war in Ukraine, you're likely to be arrested for discrediting the military. Wherever you look around the world, there's a lot of different forces and powers acting upon journalists and journalism to control what is said and how it is said.
That's certainly true. And I feel that even though that there are the protections for free speech in the United States, we still see politicians attacking the press all the time, trying to discredit it. How do we know who we should believe?
How to know who to believe can sometimes be a complicated question because there is so much competing for our attention. A good strategy, if you're just a reader or a consumer of news, is to read several outlets from organizations where for instance, who wrote the story. So who has their name on the story, who has a byline. who is quoted in the story? Is their full name given? Is it possible to verify that information yourself? Like, for instance, if a report is mentioned, can you go and find that report and find that information yourself? Which is a critical thing that sets journalism apart from, say, again, just someone posting to Facebook, right? Because fundamentally, this is the difference between opinion and journalism, the ability to go and independently verify something.
So, understandably, good journalists want to get their information right, what they're reporting. But journalism is at its heart a business. They have to sell stories. How should we think about this? That's a big conflict in terms of what needs to be said and what actually gets said.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, you're right to point out that is a big conflict in the industry right now, right? It's something that the industry is grappling with, right? Because with the advent of the internet, it changed the entire model of how news works. But what's tended to happen since then is, and the way you understand media organizations have different organizational setups. For instance, the bulk of media that you consume, whether it be the kind of Murdoch media stable in Australia right now, you've had the merger of Nine News and Fairfax together as one. These are for-profit companies, and as a for-profit company, you ultimately beholden to your shareholders, and so that changes how the journalism is produced. However, within newsrooms, there is a huge culture of separating out the business interests of a news organization from the news desk and the actual production of that news itself. And at least traditionally, journalists have been very hostile to any kind of moment where those two things meet, right? So when you look at, say, big commercial news organizations, what tends to happen is, all these organizations have written into their contracts, particularly with shareholders, that they cannot interfere in the editorial direction of the news organization itself. There was a really good example of this from a few years ago, in fact, where Gina Reinhart bought a stake in Channel 10. In doing so, she was required to sign an agreement where she would not try to interfere at all with editorial content. Ultimately, she decided that she did not want to do this, and she sold her share in the business because that was just, because she wanted that kind of editorial control. And again, that's not necessarily how journalism is done, because journalism is fundamentally different from propaganda. There is also other organizational models. Not all organizations are made the same. For instance, The Guardian is a good example. The Guardian is an organization that is organized as a public trust, therefore that there is no profit motive involved with the production of its journalism. It's ultimately about the best possible journalism itself. And just because business interests get managed in certain ways, this is not to say that there are other factors acting on journalists and media organizations themselves. Often there are questions of editorial kind of slant. There are questions of access. There are all these sorts of questions of ethics. These things still come up, but in terms of the actual business interests, there are ways of managing this.
Okay, but talking about business, certainly where I live, Fox News is one of the dominant providers. And you talked about the Murdoch stable, News Corp. Fox News is part of that. I think a dominant part of their business model is all of the opinion that they sell to people rather than news itself. What gives?
Yeah, well, and you're right to notice this, because what you're identifying is kind of the rise of infotainment. And this kind of came about over like the last 2 decades, when you have the rise of the internet and you have these media organizations looking at, well, how do we shore up our viewership or our readership? And one way to do that was to publish opinion. And if you publish opinion, it's a very cynical exercise, because it kind of appeals to two audiences in that respect. So on the one hand, whoever's giving that opinion is trying to appeal to the views of those who they agree with, and they're also trying to anger those who they disagree with. Either way, they kind of cash the check, right? Because they've immediately doubled their audiences. And we should be really clear here as well about how we understand opinion versus news, right? Opinion is quite literally just a judgment call, a value judgment about something. It's saying, I think this thing is bad. Here's why. Whereas journalism is the reverse. It's the statement of facts. It's the way of reporting that, I came here for an interview and I talked about this. Those are factual statements. There's no kind of value judgment in that.
So it seems to me that actually all of this opinion commentary is the primary business for a lot of news organizations these days.
Yeah, and you're right to notice that as a trend, because what happened when you had the introduction of the internet was that it completely changed the business models for a lot of these news organizations. Many of them tried to solve that by kind of pumping in much more opinion into the front end of their business, right? So you get people's perspectives on stuff. And that was kind of a short-term fix, but kind of has a long-term problem in the sense that it erodes confidence in the organization over time. And it's also important here that we clearly define kind of what is opinion and what is news, right? Like opinion, we should be very, very clear, right? Is just your thoughts about something. Like I might love cats. That's my opinion. I think cats are great. Dogs suck, right? Like there is an objective foundation. Both cats and dogs exist, but like I'm making a value judgment about that. That is essentially what opinion news is, right? And this is has a very cynical function because for a news organization, what it does is it means that whoever's writing that piece of opinion, that standalone story, is talking to those who agree with their opinion and those who disagree with their opinion. And so instantly they double their audience as long as you're reading, because ultimately they're going to cash the check on that. News is something different. News is about verifiable fact and information. And so that's about finding out, like, okay, like cats exist. Cats come in many different species. They have many different colors. They have many different things, and describing that detail because that is objectifiable, verifiable fact, and then arranging that in a narrative which you can consume. So, for instance, like a cat robbed the bank last Sunday. That's a verifiable statement of fact, and so that separates kind of news from your opinion.
Cat burglar, I like it. Yeah, that's hilarious. Okay, so in this particular world, though, what truly makes a journalist? You've said that it's about somebody who goes around verifying facts, but in this space, is that really what journalists need to be doing?
It's a good question, right? Because this goes to the heart of kind of what we're dealing with now. I mean, there is a very old conception, a very romantic conception that journalists afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And I quite like that as a description of what makes journalists, what defines the role of a journalist, and what makes journalism. Because ultimately, journalists are witnesses. We're witnesses to events, and we have to be honest. We have to accurately record what we see.
Interesting that you say that because we do see this phenomenon right now where people record exactly what they see and they put a narrative behind it. What comes to mind are people like Andy Ngo who go out and record events and then create edits of these events and cast a story based on the video, which a lot of folks view as objective. What's going on here?
Andy Ngo is an interesting case, right? Because he is someone that has a large popular following and a large profile and gets credited as a journalist, but I would argue is not actually a journalist. His work, his output falls more into the realm of propaganda than it does journalism because it comes to situations with a preconceived notion. And Andy Ngo edits his footage to achieve a certain outcome. Whereas the idea of journalism is that you record what happened and you show several perspectives to provide the most accurate account of events. And so there's a fundamental difference here. And also, I should also mention that Andy Ngo himself, as someone who engages in media, is someone who provides lists of, quote unquote, left-wing activists to right-wing nationalist groups, which provides something of a hit list. And that is problematic in the sense that it violates several fundamental journalist ethics, such as protection of sources and such as responsibility, balance, all these sorts of things. So when we're talking about this, yes, you're right. There's a real big distinction between those who engage in kind of journalism and those who kind of fall outside that and produce kind of content which is meaningless and amoral.
Yeah, but Andy Ngo gets views. And I think that in this day and age, I poll my students every year, and the number one source of news information that my students draw on is Facebook, right? So they're looking at stories that are being delivered to them through Facebook, generally in video form. And that's exactly what Andy Ngo provides. So you talked about the responsibilities of the journalist to verify facts and to present something which is credible. But what's the responsibility of the viewer?
The responsibility of the viewer, that's a good question, and one I will admit I haven't actually given huge thought to. Fundamentally, when you're a journalist and you're working in this space, there is a degree to which you create your material with as much sense and sensibility as you can to ensure that an accurate depiction of the world is communicated. However, you cannot control how people consume your information or what they then do with it. For instance, people who are bad faith actors will always be bad faith actors. You cannot control how they will use or misuse information. And ultimately, it is not that segment of the population that you're talking to whenever you write a report or do a piece to camera. You're ultimately talking to the people who need this information, who rely on this information to make decisions, whether that is an average person or a policymaker, because ultimately they need this information to kind of assess how they're going to approach and how they're going to act in the future.
I want to go back to the business of journalism. This is something that you have to contend with in your day to day life as a journalist because you're a freelancer, right? You have to sell stories. Can you walk me through the process of how you might pitch stories or how an editor asks you to do work for them?
Absolutely. And my relationship to my editors is bi-directional. So on the one hand, I will sell them stories. I will maybe observe something or hear something, and I will go follow it up with a few preliminary interviews, and then I will take that to them and then say, "Hey guys, I've learned about this thing. It's either happening tomorrow or it's happened. I have this thing. Are you interested?" And they say yes or no. And when they say yes, that gives me my commission, which is my authority to go ask further questions. And from that point, I go talk to several people. And some stories are very simple and they require, say, like, 4 or 5 people to talk to. Some stories are very complicated. And I've talked to 30, even 40 and 50, people as part of a story, which is an incredible amount of work. It takes a lot of time. Now, once I've spoken to all those people, I will then sit down with that information. I will process it. I will pull together the quotes, the relevant bits of information. I will pull it together into a story, and I will write it in a way that is communicable. Once I give that to my editor, then a whole other process takes over. So at that point, they review it to make sure that it has everything that they need, and then they will maybe make some slight changes or ask some questions that send me back to ask for more information. And then once they accept it, it goes to a sub-editor. That sub-editor then proofs it for first, grammar and spelling and style, and then also facts to make sure everything's correct, whether it's spelling of names, down to kind of locations of towns, down to did this thing actually happen? Is there verifiable proof that this happened? And then from there, several other checks will be performed if it's deemed necessary. For instance, a story might be legal, or a story might get reviewed by the editor again to make sure it's okay. People sit down and talk about how they're going to present this before it ultimately gets published. And once it gets published, then there are several steps afterwards in terms of promoting, make sure people know it is published, letting people who are involved in the story know, these sorts of kind of ancillary activities.
So there's a lot that's going on there, but in this day and age, the news cycle is really quick. How fast do you have to do all of this stuff?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. So on the one hand, I mean, we should keep in mind that what encompasses news is a vast spectrum of stuff, whether it's kind of very short 400 to 500 word news reports through to like, 1,000, 2,000 word features kind of investigating a subject. Now, and any job you get on a different day could be completely different. I mean, for instance, a simple report recording, say, a sporting event or a court case or a political speech will be 400 to 500 words saying simply what happened. And there is a very specific, structured way of writing that because news ultimately is a very structured product. However, those stories get produced incredibly quickly. Like, for instance, I've been assigned stories and I've had a few hours to kind of pull it together because ultimately you're working towards, you want to get this to your editor. And if you're on TV, it's a much more tighter process because you're trying to produce, say, 30 seconds to a minute long of a TV package that you need to get to your producer by 4 p.m. so it can be broadcast at 5 p.m. In print and digital, you're still trying to get that to your editors so they can get to the subs so they can get published by 5 p.m. and people can actually read it. Because, again, ultimately, news is about ensuring people read it or view it.
Now, one of the things that I've noticed is really hard to come by, but it still exists in some corners of the internet. Like The Guardian, for instance, is this long read or the long format journalism. And I think some of the most famous examples have to be like the expose on Enron, for example, right? This was a type of investigation that took a tremendous amount of people power in order to properly investigate. I don't see that as much today. What's going on there? And is it something that's to the detriment of how the public understands the world?
And look, you're right to pick up on this. This kind of long form journalism, this creative nonfiction, this deep dive, these investigative stories is my passion. It's the thing that I particularly work in and I love and I often produce. But also when you had the kind of rise of the internet and the kind of disruption that brought to the model that was news media, one of the first things people started doing was looking for ways to cut costs, And one of the ways to cut costs was to cut that sort of long form, that kind of more detailed investigation of the facts. And the reason is because it takes a lot of time, a lot of money to produce, and it doesn't always produce results. There was a really good example from Mother Jones in the US, which is a big investigative journalism magazine. But I am speaking from memory here. They spent 3 months working on a story about the conditions within a prison. It got published. It spent maybe a day or two on the news cycle and only generated a fraction of the money required to actually produce it. So you can see how the economics of this doesn't always pan out. And traditionally what happened was the money that was made in terms of just general news, in terms of advertising revenue, was able to kind of subsidize the production of this stuff. But as that has fallen away, it's become harder and harder to produce. That said, there are several news outlets working to produce just that. For instance, in Australia, there is a publication called the Saturday Paper that publishes kind of 14,000 word news articles, which, in terms of bare news reporting, can kind of cover just the facts in a more detailed way, but occasionally veers into that kind of more detailed exploration of the issues in an approach that is incredibly powerful.
So, one thing that is certain is that when we talk about journalism, we're talking about a business that is competing in an attention economy, right? So, editors have to make really important decisions in terms of what they commission. How do they go about deciding what is newsworthy? And I guess since we're talking about criminology in this video series, how would an editor go about thinking about which crimes to prioritize when we're talking about the articles that they would commission?
Those are two really important questions. And the first one relates to kind of the structure of the Australian news media as an ecosystem, right? So, within Australia, you have the Australian Associated Press, or otherwise known as the AAP. You have the ABC, which is the state broadcaster, and then you have the assortment of other private, organizations that are kind of TV or print news based and kind of operating in their own specific audiences. Now, what tends to happen every day, editors get together and they sit around and they go, okay, what are the biggest stories of the day? And they see what was published overnight, particularly in a place like the AAP or the ABC, and then they formulate, okay, well, what's going to be in our news agenda today? And so they take ideas from their reporters who may have heard things that haven't been reported anywhere else. They bring that to the editors. They take ideas from what's been reported elsewhere, and they mix it together and they go, okay, this is our news agenda, and they assign tasks and they send everyone out into the field to do that. And then if something else happens during the day, something develops, they will reassign people or assign additional people to that story, and that becomes news, right? That becomes what you hear when you go home at night at 5 p.m. So that's kind of the broad structure. And the second part of the question is kind of as it relates to crime is really interesting again because the mix of crime, celebrity, and sport kind of make up the bulk of tabloid media and make up a lot of media generally, right? And courts, when you cover courts as a reporter, it's a really interesting place to be because they're a source of regular, methodical news stories that what's going to happen. Everything occurs in an orderly time period, so you can turn up, you can watch, you can write it down accurately, and you're protected by privilege, and then you can go and report that information. So crime becomes a really core part of media, right? And it also plays to audiences really well because crime is something, and especially as we understand it, is something immediate. The violence involved, the characters involved, it's clear who are the bad guys and who are the good guys, and we can immediately sympathize with the victims. And so, when you see news organizations, they kind of not necessarily play to this, but this plays really well with the audience. People want to know what is happening with this bad thing.
So you're talking about things which are immediate, but there's a lot of really bad stuff that happens, which happens incrementally. Is that not newsworthy?
Absolutely, and this is where we kind of get into the more technical side of things. So when we're talking about white-collar crime or issues of corruption, these are things that are, as you say, not immediate. They're something where the harm is cumulative, that builds up over time. These are slow build processes, and it's hard to necessarily capture attention because it's not so obvious to people what's going on. But often these crimes are the ones that cause the most harm, right? Like when you have, say, a grandmother who has lost her life savings because she invested in something on bad advice, and this has been going on over 12 years, right? She might be, she might lose her home. She might become homeless as a result of this, right? And that's a real tangible harm for a person who is, kind of elderly. But the consequences of this for a lot of people isn't easily drawn between A and B, and so we often miss out on this chain of events. However, there is a lot of reporting about this stuff. The challenge is being able to follow the story long enough to be able to kind of keep up with it.
Now, I guess that cuts to my next question. The time arcs of reporting have changed dramatically over the past century for sure. We've gone from newspapers to radio to TV to internet, and everything gets shorter. What's the consequence of this?
Yeah, well, you're right. We're living in a 24-hour media environment, right? Where we kind of you can turn on the TV on the literally 24-hour channels. You can log on to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can have stuff beamed right into your phone. There is this sense that news is constant. It's everywhere. It's universal. And part of this is there's a really good reporter, Charlie LaDuff, in the US that explains it like this, right? There's this news is bad for a reason, right? Because it's stuff that shouldn't happen. So in the ordinary course of a life, you should be able to grow up, go to school, get a job, meet someone, worship whatever religion you like, grow old, have children if you want to or not, and then pass away surrounded by friends and loved ones comfortably in, wherever you are. Anything that interrupts that chain is news, right? Because it shouldn't happen. News is unusual. It's something that's kind of that's unexpected. And the perception that the reason why news is bad is because a lot of that stuff is bad. And so when you live in an environment where news is constant, it's beamed into your home, beamed into your phone, it's all around you, there can be the perception that everything's bad all the time.
Well, one of the things that I think really concerns a lot of people is how different news sources might be biased. But me as a researcher, this is something that I feel like is inherent to any type of information production. What can you tell me about bias in terms of journalistic integrity and how news stories come together?
And look, that's a really good question, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and my thoughts are still evolving. In layman's terms, bias is something that people use to describe something that primarily that they don't agree with, because there is some sense that something is wrong. And so I sense that what people are trying to refer to is this idea that there's a particular editorial slant and that the conclusions of the report are inevitable. But often this tends to hide or obscure what's really going on with a news report, because just because a reporter decides to cover something or focus on a particular issue does not make that inevitable or biased, or the conclusion of that somehow wrong or misinformed, right? And every report is based on several perspectives. Ideally there is research that has gone into this. And just because a particular reporter focuses on a particular subject does not make them biased for choosing to do so. There is often a very good public interest in exploring that topic, because ultimately that's what reporters do, right? They find information and they report that in the public interest. And this is in contrast to other actors in kind of the world. Whereas when you deal with police and law enforcement, they act in the interest of the state. Reporters ideally should always act in the interest of the public by bringing new information to light. And within Australia, there is how this plays out is can be very difficult. For instance, the ABC, which is the state broadcaster, has it written into the law that it has to be balanced and unbiased in its reporting. But sometimes people don't agree that that is the case.
So, depending on which news we consume influences the way that we see the world. I think now there are more than ever a diversity of sources that people draw from. Is it really possible for the press to set the agenda?
It's a very good question, and one that is increasingly being challenged, because as much as journalism, as the world of organized media, has come under siege from these alternative forms, whether it be from YouTube to being social media to being whatever else, it still remains primary, right? So what gets reported on the ABC, on Sky News, in the pages of the Australian or your local paper, still dictates public discussion. It's still something that politicians and policymakers respond to, because that is kind of the issue of the day.
Okay. Sometimes journalists get it wrong. I'm sure that there's been a couple times, at least in your career, that you screwed up, right? It's inevitable. We all make mistakes. What happens when that happens?
When you're a working journalist, you have an ethical responsibility to correct the public record. So where you become aware that a mistake has been made, you then need to take steps to correct that. So, for instance, if I make a mistake on a story, I will then contact my editor. I will explain the situation and what happened. And sometimes, and there's a spectrum of this, right? Say if it's a case of just, oh, there's a word missing from a quote. That word will be added in because that is for clarity and that is how it should have been. On the far end of the spectrum, if there's something, a factual error, that needs to change. And when a factual error to change in the story, usually what happens is a note gets added to the bottom, which creates a record that, hey, there was a mistake here. And that is to ensure that you can then, that you know as a reader that, hey, this journalist, this outlet is a responsible journalist, a responsible outlet. Where they make a mistake and it can be proven to be incorrect, they will then update the record accordingly.
So, speaking of getting it wrong, we see a lot of politicians make this accusation towards journalists today. They like to say that there's a lot of fake news out there. Is that true? And where does this idea of fake news really come from?
And look, it's a good point. And like I would respond by saying that a lot of politicians have a particular interest in casting the reporting of their activities and their views as somehow inaccurate because they want to get re-elected, and it suits their interest. However, there is a origin to this, and that the history of kind of politicians attacking the media in this way goes back to Nazi Germany, when you have the kind of creation of propaganda and public relations. This idea that organizations and authorities can influence the way the news is reported. And in Nazi Germany, there was the invention of the term lying press to refer to journalists who tried to hold the Nazis to account. That fell away within the World War II, but we've seen a revival in a different form of this idea of fake news. And again, this term gets used and abused. Again, sometimes journalists do make mistakes. Sometimes things get, misreported, right? A journalist who is honest and credible will try to correct the record where they make a mistake in good faith. But this idea of fake news as applying to all media organizations is an attack made in bad faith, meaning that it's not particularly interested in the outcome, it's not particularly interested in correcting a record or having a shared record of events. It's purely about trying to stop critical voices from holding power to account.
Okay, I want to bring this discussion back to crime. If there was one kind of crime that you wish you could cover and currently don't have the resources to cover the way that you would like to, what would it be and why?
I think hands down it would be white collar crime and corruption. I mean, those are the two areas which affect us all, affect us profoundly, and in ways that we cannot always anticipate. I think the focus on kind of murder and violence is particularly focused on working class crime. I don't think it's particularly interesting. I think it's pretty obvious about what happens in that situation. But I think that the issues raised when you deal with these kind of more abstract sense are not only intellectually fascinating, but also so much more profound for the consequences for the rest of society.
If you were actually able to do that, what kind of resources would you need?
Part of the problem with this is that the information required to investigate this stuff is locked up in databases. So not only do you need to be able to pour through court cases and attend hearings to see what people say in court, and to be able to know this is going on, you also need to be able to pour through kind of databases of documents to literally create the murder board, to be able to piece together what happened, and in a way that stacks up, that is defensible both to the public and in a court.
It's a very challenging endeavor. Well, Royce, thank you so much for dropping by to let me know how news media works in this day and age. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.